So it's in line.
That's good. Okay, hello and good evening, everyone. Today I'm speaking to, on the right, it's Jason Hayes, and on the left, it's Joshua Antonini. So make a little cross with the numbers there. They're from the Mackinac Center in Michigan.
Correct.
So, yeah, both you gentlemen, welcome.
Yeah. And that one, the C is silent. It's a Michigan thing. It's Mackinac. But
Mackinac.
yeah.
Okay, Mackinac Center. There we go. Maybe you guys give us a little of a background. So, just for listeners, the topic today is why the cost of nuclear energy is misunderstood. And Joshua wrote a very interesting article, and we'll go into detail maybe later on the levelized cost of energy and why the metrics we are using does not make a lot of sense. First, I just want to give you guys an opportunity. Give me a background. What does the Mackinac Center do?
Well, the Mackinac Center is a free market think tank that's based in Michigan and is primarily focused on state issues. So our first focus is Michigan policy, Michigan politics, that kind of thing. But then we also do a broader, wider discussion of, in our case, energy and environmental policy. So looking at electricity regulation, utility regulation, forest management, water, wildlife, fisheries, those sorts of things. So whatever you can imagine would fit under an energy and environment umbrella, that's what the Environmental Policy Initiative, which I lead up at the Mackinac Center, is responsible for. But Mackinac broadly is, again, a state-based free market think tank.
Okay, that's interesting, and I encourage people to read your website. It's got some interesting articles over there. I want to sort of just the first question to get it out there, because when everyone speaks about energy, there's always a question of conflict of interest. Are you paid to say what you're saying, basically? So I have to ask you: are you funded in any way by the nuclear industry or anything of that sort?
No, but they're welcome to fund us. I'm totally happy because all of our funding comes from private individuals. We do not accept any government funding. So if there are people in the nuclear industry listening, you're welcome to email. I would not mind having that. But the reality is that we do not allow, or we do not have influence from our donors. So whoever they are, whether they're foundations or private citizens or whatever, we tell them right on our website, you can see it, that we do the work that we do based on free market principles. And if you want to support that, then please do. If you think that you're going to be able to support the Mackinac Center and then tell us, oh yeah, by the way, we need you to write this, we would just say, okay, well, you need to find another group to support, because we don't allow donors to dictate what we publish.
Well, on top of that, I myself am a, 20, just turned 21-year-old intern, and so I'm definitely not, in the pockets of I find interesting things to say, no one has covered this to, I think, a degree that would be appropriate. And well, if not us, then who? So I figured, I'll write about this. So, when it comes to the writing of the articles themselves, it's definitely not from, we got a contract from some donor. Oh, you gotta talk about, no, I just thought, wow, why is nuclear energy being vilified to a degree that is really unwarranted, and misunderstood as well in terms of oh my gosh, it's so much more expensive. Is it? Is it really? Are there factors making that shouldn't be the case? That kind of thing. So. Okay,
that's fair. And just for the listeners who haven't listened to me before, my background is so I'm a structural engineer by, my bachelor's degree in civil engineering. I sort of moved into the structural field. I did work on nuclear power stations. So I worked on Hinkley Point, and I can tell you now that project is very expensive. It's not the way I would manage it. I worked at ITER, which is a fusion reactor. Fusion is 25 years away, is the old joke. So I know all of those stories, and many of those critiques are valid. At the moment, I work on wind farms for the European Union. So if there is a bias, I totally am on the renewable side of things as it currently stands, but also I work for a contractor that's got industry with the oil and gas industry. So, it's all over the place. People can blame me for whatever they want. So I want to sort of get into, just to get that out of the way, to get into the topic of discussion, which is the real price of nuclear industry. And Joshua, you wrote a very interesting article where you mentioned that the LCOE metric, the levelized cost of energy, is being misused. Can you maybe explain for listeners what is that metric, and then maybe we'll unpack it from there.
Yeah, well, so levelized cost of energy is sort of, it is not what is applicable for consumers. It is more for the investment side of things, sort of taking a look at the costs over the lifetime of any form of energy production facility over the electrical production that it will have over its lifetime. There are, it's a more complicated equation than that, but all the things that go into that, that's the baseline. And so fundamentally, it is useful for certain specific applications, but in general, is still not an excellent metric. The Energy Information Administration, sorry. Yeah, it's the government. Yeah. They did a report in early 2020 in March that talks about how technically, solar energy has a lower levelized cost of energy, a lower LCOE than natural gas combined cycle production plant. But, they do not anticipate solar being increased. And it's like, well, if it's cheaper, why? It's like, well, because I think their exact words are, it is problematic and misleading the LCOE in and of itself as just a be all end all. Oh, it's cheaper. That's how it is. It's like, no, there are many things that doesn't take into account, which I can go into if you like.
Yeah, I would sort of say, but the bankers, I mean, and the investors, when you talk with them, they obviously want a number. What does it cost? How fast can I get my money back? And they all do cite LCOE, and they say, look, if I have a diagram, comparing technology by technology, if I were to build a nuclear power station and I were build a solar plant, they would tell me, but look, the solar panels, it's just gonna get me my money back faster, right? Is that a correct representation?
Yeah, the issue with LCOE is if you're comparing solar with wind, then that's a good metric. If you're trying to compare wind or solar with nuclear or large baseload coal or any, like whether it's simple cycle gas or combined cycle gas, any of those sorts of things, you run into a lot of problems. The primary reason is because of what's called intermittency. The wind does not blow 24/7 and the sun does not shine 24/7. So you have an issue of, it's called capacity factor, that wind and solar tend to have a lower capacity factor than does nuclear. Nuclear has like a 97% capacity factor. Wind, depending on where you are, obviously offshore wind has higher, but onshore wind throughout the United States is around 30 to 35%. So now what capacity factor is, if your listeners aren't familiar with that, is if you take the peak, the maximum amount that a technology can produce of electricity, and then essentially divide into it what it actually does produce, then you come up with a number, a percentage. And so wind, to put it in like a rough kind of gross explanation, wind produces electricity about 30% of the time. Solar in Michigan, for example, where we're located, has a 16 to 17% capacity factor. Now, in the summer, that's higher. In the winter, it's much lower. It goes down to around 6 or 7%. Compare that to a large baseload coal plant. They run at about 85 to 87%, and nuclear is up over 90. So they're very different capacity factors, which means that it impacts on pricing. So if you're trying to say, okay, well, wind, which is only producing 30-ish% of the time, and you don't know exactly what 30%, because the wind blows and then it stops, and it blows and it stops. So it's intermittent. You can't trust it the same way. When you try to compare those costs, you get skewed results. So if you just say, look, wind costs some number, $25, $30 per megawatt that you're going to build it. Okay, well, that's very different than what you're building with nuclear, because you're not getting essentially the same service. So you have to, if you're going to do LCOE and try to compare apples to apples, you need to have, okay, we're going to build wind, but we're also going to build battery backup, or we're going to build wind and we're going to build a simple cycle natural gas turbine, or we're going to build wind and we're going to build several hundred miles of transmission. So then those extra costs, and we're also going to build, should be added to the LCOE of the
Right.
intermittent or variable.
So to understand it correctly, you have to look at the complete system and not just a single component, basically.
Correct.
Although I've read stuff from Amory Lovins, and I think you guys criticized him a little bit on that, and he makes the argument, just to throw it out there, that a correct combination of wind and solar would reduce the intermittency problem. You don't need storage. That's what he's been saying. And you might only need a peaking gas plant for 4 or 5 days a year in places like Germany. And if a country has hydro, which is obviously not everywhere,
Right.
that can compensate it. So what do you make of that argument?
Well, I mean, first of all, you're talking about, so there are many problems. The first one being, okay, you have to make these things, and making solar panels, making, wind turbines, and the kind of transmission you would need to avoid a battery storage to be able to get, oh, well, it's sunny here and it's not sunny here. They can, the sunny places can help the non-sunny places. It's like, I'm writing an article right now about how transmission for that kind of thing is orders of magnitude more than is understood or realized. Like, to be able to, oh, don't worry, we don't really have to worry about, a base load. These function. It's like, one, doubtful. But assuming that's the case, those costs are something that is also not taken into account. Just the kind of, rare earth metals you'd need to mine, rare earth minerals you need to mine. I mean, it's not that they're rare exactly, it's that they are sparsely, populated in a chunk of land. So what that means is you have to.
They aren't mined by they are not mined by labor unions members either. I mean, so somebody comes from South Africa, I'm well aware of the issues in the DRC and all those issues that are attached with them, and how that in turn corrupts our politics, which I have not seen people comment on. But we have a serious problem with Dutch disease on the African continent. It just
Well, and I mean, China as well. I mean, there's disconcerting evidence that a lot of polysilicon that is used in photovoltaic cells of all kinds is very much made with Uyghur slave labor, which is, to put it nicely, not great. To put it more impolitely, horrible and incredibly unethical. So I'd rather, the guys on the oil rig do it who are paid handsomely than, children in Congo or, slave labor in China. So if we're talking
that's fair. Okay, but just to play devil's advocate again, it's not that coal miners are doing well either. So I mean, I get this you can spin it either way. So I just want to get into then again this LCOE thing, because you see that's sort of at the root of the cost. How would you then evaluate? I mean, if an investor would look at it and they would say, look, give me a bunch of metrics that I need to decide on for nuclear power. And obviously, don't try and mislead me with it. Like, what would you propose that we use to make the argument for baseload?
One of the big things with nuclear that often doesn't get discussed is full life cycle. So a nuclear plant will typically run 80, and some of them now they're having their permits extended even out to 100 years. So compare that with wind and solar, which have a 15 to 25 year life cycle. So you're rebuilding wind and solar 3 or 4 times compared to a large nuclear plant. So you have to recognize those. People will just present LCOE numbers and say, well, wind is some number, $3, or whereas nuclear is, 6 to 8 or something like that. It's like, okay, but you're building wind 3 to 4 times. Then also, to go back to what you had said previously, is, okay, Amory Lovin says, well, we can just interconnect everything. Okay, well, then you have to pay for, literally multiple millions of dollars per mile for building transmission. That's just the cost. Then you go into eminent domain issues. Where are those power lines going to go? Okay, we're going to have to move you out of your home. You may have lived there in Europe for several hundred years, but now we need a transmission line to go through. So Amory's plan works. Okay, so you've got those issues. Then, as Josh already said, you've got the mining issues, not only the labor issues. Are you getting an 8-year-old kid to go down into the ground to mine for the cobalt in DRC? Are you, forcing Uyghur Muslims to produce polysilicon in the Xinjiang region of China. All of those kind of issues, you have to say, okay, well, instead, like Josh said, I'd rather have somebody who is working under very strict environmental regulations in Europe or Canada or the US. They're being paid well. Like you said, the coal miners. Okay, well, the average coal miner in the US or in Canada, they make about 85, 90,000 US a year. So yes, it's a dirty job. Yes, it's extremely physical. That I understand. I mean, in my past life, I worked as a forester, so I'm very comfortable with the idea of going out at, like in Canada, minus 30, minus 35 Celsius, and spending an 8-hour day outside walking through snow, hip deep snow. Sometimes there are people who do those jobs, and the coal miners are a perfect example of it. But I mean, kudos to them. They do hard work and they keep our homes warm. So those guys, I've got a ton of respect for.
Yeah.
But you're dealing with those issues, and that's all got to be added into the cost. How are we paying for these things? Well, if we're going to do wind and solar, we're going to have to increase our mining by orders of magnitude. So we're going to have to up our mining of copper, of, like we said, rare earth minerals, aluminum, steel, all of these things. You're going to have to increase by double to up to, in some cases, if you read work done by people like Mark Mills from the Manhattan Institute, 2,500% to 5,000%. Okay, so costs, environmental impacts, all of these things have to be taken into account. And there's more to these costs and those sort of things than just CO2 emissions. And they all needed to be added into the mix.
Yeah, well, and the example that I use, I borrow from Mark Nelson at the Radiant Energy Fund. His example is, I think, very illustrative as to the problems with LCOE. He says, okay, so we're standing in New York City and we're gonna, go to London. What is the cheapest way we can do it? And it's like, okay, well, swimming is the cheapest way we can get there. It's like, yeah, I mean, you can talk with all your, scientist fellows and be like, oh yeah, we've done the calculations, and yeah, I mean, the infrastructure you need to build, airports and stuff costs a lot. You have to hire pilots and train them. Oh my goodness. I mean, and then, you get a lot of workout in, okay, maybe there's opportunity costs with like, okay, you have to learn to swim this much and you get stamina, but that is the cheapest way. You'll die. We're not going to swim. You've got to be kidding me. No, but it's the cheapest way. And it's like, oh yeah, no. In the Western, more developed countries, like, yeah, we're not gonna power everything with wind and solar. I mean, some are trying, but that's not going so hot. And so it's like, okay, we're not going to do this. But hey, developing nations, do you want funds? Here, have some, crappy solar panel. It's like, oh wow, I mean, Darnay, India was famously the first city that was, oh my goodness, in India, powered by entirely solar power, and within like, what is it? A couple weeks, they were throwing away like, yeah, can we have real energy? Can we have real power? Because this is not it,
Well, it's a big debate coming on the African continent, and it's one I've been trying to raise, is that by the end of this century, 4 out of 10 people will be African. And I want a practical solution. I mean, as I say, I can build all these things from a structural point of view. It's not an issue. But I would like to have a practical solution to get to net zero, assuming we even want to get there, because I'm also doubtful we will get there. But, be that as it may, if that's public policy, fine. I accept the law. I'm not going to go against that. And nuclear seems to be a low-hanging fruit,
Right.
And do you guys have any idea as to why it is so demonized?
Well, that's an interesting question. It depends on why you're asking. Not why, but like how cynical you want to be. In general, ideology plays a big part, frankly. Simply put, there was a concern in the late Cold War, say 60s, 70s, that, oh my goodness, there was a conflation of nuclear energy and nuclear war. And while since 1970, and the Non-Proliferation Treaty, no fissile material has been turned into nuclear weapons, people are still afraid of proliferation. Like, oh my goodness, we have to stop nuclear energy because it could lead to nuclear war and all this stuff. It's like, these are two very different things. We, instead of using it for war, are able to use it for peace. Isn't that awesome? But many people think, oh my goodness, and you see, The Simpsons, and it's like, oh my goodness, he's, playing around. It's like, these are very serious people who are not playing around with green glowing tubes, like, no, this is a very very professional business that Fukushima had a tsunami and no one died of the radiation. That is not a condemnation. Oh my goodness, there was a meltdown. No, the surprising thing is that no one died of radiation. That is an amazing thing, that, wow, nuclear is really safe, but safety concerns are often, at least to the public, oh my goodness, we couldn't possibly, nuclear plant, are you kidding me? In my town? I don't want to get cancer. It's like the background radiation of living next to a nuclear plant is less than eating a banana or going on an airplane. I mean, it's just not.
Well, you speak of background radiation. I've got another interesting topic for you to research on, which is that the LNT model of radiation is outdated. I'm not sure if you do have any opinion on that one.
It's not great. Yeah, well, so LNT is short for linear no threshold. And so the idea behind linear no threshold is that, okay, what you have is, if something is lethal, then there's, I guess, a linear line of it being lethal. And so, well, there's a proportionate amount of it being not good. And so, well, you should just not. Basically, the idea is, well, the analogy would be, well, eating, whatever, 1,000 apples, because apples have a small amount of cyanide in their seeds. Like, well, eating 1,000 apples would kill you. So you should not have apples, or you should dramatically, it's like, that's not, okay, so I won't eat 1,000 apples. You do realize that if between apple eating sessions, I don't eat apples, okay, between doses of radiation, you aren't constantly, it doesn't build up like, a video game bar, it decreases. You can explain.
But also there's the threshold aspect is important, because the LNT linear no threshold above in any sort of dealing with poisons or toxins to our system, most of them operate on, if you stay below the threshold, you're safe. And in many cases, even in the case of radiation, there's actually a hormetic effect that it strengthens your body. They've done research, and I forget where the paper was published, but literally they took like paramecium out of just normal atmospheric radiation, and they kept them in petri dishes in a protected area. And essentially what happened is the paramecia started to die because they didn't have the radiation coming in from the sun and just from the world around them. And so they took them out of the protective environment and allowed them to be exposed again to just normal atmospheric radiation, and they kind of picked back up. They were becoming healthy again. But again, many of these issues, like Josh said, if you can live right beside a nuclear plant, it's actually more dangerous to sleep with your spouse or your partner. There's more radiation coming off of a human body than there is coming from a nuclear power plant. So it's more dangerous, if you're worried about LNT, to sleep with your spouse or your partner.
Okay, you should not let the Puritans hear that one.
But I mean, it gives you an example of just, okay, LNT may not be the most reasonable. I mean, getting back to the topic of discussion, LCOE, same thing. It may not be the most reasonable measure by which we guide our policy. So when we recognize that there are thresholds, and below the threshold, you're safe, and many times not only safe, but actually strengthening your body. It's the same as exercise. A little bit of exercise is good for you. Too much exercise, you can harm yourself, you can injure yourself, or if you go way overboard, you could have a heart attack or something. But keeping it below a certain level is healthful and beneficial for you. It makes you healthier, helps you to live longer, helps you to live a better life.
The likely apocryphal tale of Marathon, he died at the end. But as long as you don't run until you die, running is good.
Well, the example I have is in Ramsar in Iran. I think it's the place in the world with the highest level of background radiation, and it's higher than Chernobyl. And that's where the Shah went with his wife on his lovely spas. So they were bathing in radiation, and they seemed to be quite healthy at the time,
Right.
And there's this holiday resort there where you can have hot springs and you're exposed to radiation, and people there seem to be quite healthy. So the idea that radiation is dangerous at low levels is frankly absurd, and it's not based on any scientific study.
Correct.
But unfortunately, that's what drives public policy, and that also adds to the cost of nuclear.
Right. And even in places like Chernobyl, the obvious example of how not to do nuclear technology. The wildlife populations in that area in the exclusion zone, wildlife populations are booming and they're quite healthy. So again, another study that was published recently showed that. I believe it was in the journal Nature. I'd have to go back and look because I'm just from memory remembering this. But yeah, wildlife populations are booming in that area. And it's primarily because it's an exclusion zone. People are not just kind of going through doing what people do. So it's a natural area for wildlife to just go and live their lives.
You mentioned in your article as well about the cost, or maybe not just the cost, but the time it takes to build a nuclear power station. And, Hinkley Point, which I worked on, is a good example of how not to do a project. Do you maybe speak a little bit to that? Why is it that in the 1980s we could build nuclear power stations in France in 4 to 5 years, and today we can't even get one done in, what's it now, 10, 15 years in some places?
Yeah. Our unfortunate culprit would be the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, established in the early 70s. Since their inception in the United States, there has not been, I believe that's still the case, because the Vogtle plant in South North Carolina on the border has not been completed, but I'm fairly certain that
it's just coming online now.
Exactly. So maybe technically one or two, because it's like a whatever, basically very, 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 very few, if any, nuclear plants have been built from beginning of construction to coming online since its inception, because of onerous regulatory processes. Reading.
And on these regulatory, the regulator, and I've worked for a regulator, and they're some of the most stubborn, unimaginatory people you've ever met. But they would argue, but we've got better safety standards now. We learned from Fukushima and Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, and this is just the way we have to do it. And if you don't like it, well, your product is not economically viable. But what do you say to that?
You can make, it's as if saying, well, we have a web developer on our team who is super important. We only have one, and so we only have $50,000 to pay him. Otherwise, it's not efficient. He only provides, that's his marginal revenue product. Well, if he dies, that would be horrible. What if ninjas came in and assassinated him? Well, then we should put in $400,000 paid, bodyguards to protect him. Well, now he's no longer viable. Yes, but maybe if you just make an accurate risk assessment and be like, the likelihood that he's going to be assassinated by ninjas is quite low. And so, we can just have a reasonable amount of security in the building, maybe like a key card to get in. And now we're being reasonable. It's like, you could go way, way, way over the top in terms of, nothing will ever go wrong ever. It's like, yes, but that's redundant. You don't see France having massive nuclear meltdowns all the time. And their average time to build a plant was 5 to 8 years up until fairly recently.
It used to be. It's no longer the case.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But so the problem with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is they'll say, it's like a simple 15-step process. But one of those steps is go through the EPA's 40-step process. One of those steps is go through the various state bureaucracies, go through more federal bureaucracies, go through more and more and more. It's like, these are levels of redundancy that, of course, make it nigh, impossible to fund, or as time progresses, cost goes up exponentially. It's like, well, of course, because now you have more lawyers, now you have more going back and forth and waiting, and the NRC is legally supposed to get various exceptions of blueprints within a certain time frame, and they just don't. What do you do? Sue them?
In France, we have what is called ASN, Agence Sûreté Nucléaire, and it's basically a similar. It became a demon of its own. It was probably instituted for right reasons. There was maybe reasons to reevaluate the systems, but as time went on, they started thinking of themselves as the gods of the nuclear industry,
right.
And this also chased skilled and creative people out of the industry. And that's why France cannot build a nuclear power station in a decent point of time, right? So I assume something similar happened in America, because at the moment, the creativity is in China. It's in South Korean plants that are built by South African engineers in Dubai, but South Africa cannot get their own project going.
Yeah.
It is built by, I think Iran even announced this week that they are going to go solo and have their own nuclear design.
Yes.
Right. So other countries are looking into it, but the Western countries are being dragged down by regulation.
Yeah.
At the same time, we're seeing the same sort of response and reaction from wind and solar. So in the US, we just had Hurricane Ian come through up over Florida and then out up the eastern coast, there were several areas that had solar and wind that were impacted by the strong winds in this area. And so there's been discussions from various regulatory bodies saying, look, we need to do something to make sure that these plants or these facilities, solar and wind facilities that we're building, are able to withstand these kind of winds, because we're putting them into an area that's known to have hurricanes come through on a regular basis. So it only makes sense to set regulatory guidelines that say these things have to be able to withstand some number, 75, 100 mile per hour winds. Okay. The response from the wind and solar developers is, no, look, hang on. You're going to make us uneconomical. We're not going to be able to compete. So it's like, hang on. Didn't we just hear that same sort of thing from the coal plants and the gas plants and the nuclear plants? Why is it that these types of electricity producers, wind and solars, don't have to meet these same kind of strict reliability and safety standards? Why should they get a bump when they're already getting 30 to 35% of their costs provided by, in the United States, the American taxpayer? So we're seeing like the production tax credit and the intermittent tax credit are being used to basically pay for a lot of the costs of developing these things. So they get a special tax break. Oh yeah, and they don't have to meet stringent reliability and safety standards. But all of their competitors have to meet those standards and also have to pay for things like, oh, well, we need to take care of full life cycle costs. So we're going to start pricing for CO2 emissions. We're going to mandate the minimum levels of emissions for NOx and SOx and particulate matter and all those kind of things. So why is it that wind and solar don't have to meet those same strict standards? That's the obvious question, because as soon as they do, now they're not competitive.
Well, so my first article was actually about solar panels and the fact that, solar waste is a very large problem. What do you do with panels when they go bad after 15, 20 years? And they can be cracked. And the toughest ones have very poor capacity factor. It's like, what do you do about that? It's like solar waste is a huge issue. I think it was Environmental Progress. They had done a report that had said that solar panels produce 300 times the amount of waste than nuclear power plants do, adjusted for the amount of energy they actually produce. It's like, I don't think that's being priced in,
No, they don't price it in at the moment. I mean, basically what they do, they make a big hole and they put it in the ground. Just frankly,
Correct.
what we do for most waste. I mean, I'm not even against that sometimes, because I think a lot of these full life cycle costs are exactly what you say. It's more of a means to keep the competitor out.
Right.
The South African coal lobby for years were lobbying for that for other industries, but not for themselves, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so it's just political economy. I don't see it as a it's an argument, sure. I mean, if you're going to apply the same rule, apply it everywhere. But I would say that we're missing the bigger boat, which is that this is actually just a grift for other industries.
Yeah, and the other part of it is that if we're going to make these decisions, we have, as a society, decided we're going to move away from one form, it's coal or natural gas. We're going to move away from fossil fuels, and we're going to go to ostensibly green, not emitting technologies. Okay, well, let's at least do it honestly and recognize that there are costs associated with it. There are economic costs, there are environmental costs, there are social costs, and let's be aware of them. Not pretend that one energy source is completely benevolent and benign, and then just the other one is all evil and bad and can't do anything good. No, let's be honest about it. Yes, there are costs associated with using fossil fuels. Typically, they relate to emissions. That's the biggest one. But now there are costs associated with using wind and solar, intermittency, mining, all of those kind of issues, wildlife issues. There, just admit them. And then let's do an actual honest balancing, which takes us back to your initial idea of LCOE. How are we actually comparing these costs? This is an important discussion that needs to be had. And again, if we're doing it in a fraudulent or fake way and just kind of hiding the costs of one and saying one is good, but the other one is bad, We ignore the benefits associated with one and just only focus on its costs. We ignore the costs of one and only focus on emissions. Then we're not actually serving the public, which is what we're trying to do.
And that's sort of my biggest grudge against. I mean, it's actually the energy sector in general, but at the moment, it's the renewable guys being a little bit more dishonest. But I mean, I'm under no illusion that the fossil fuel industry's lobbied for wars and things of that sort. So I'm under no illusion that I'm not pretending anyone is an angel here.
Right.
But like another example that sort of irritates me is that they're saying fossil fuels are getting lots of subsidies, which might be true in the past, but at the moment, they are basically saying that is the carbon offsets. Okay, fine. But that's not really the same thing as the government throwing money at something. So you can't say fossil fuels are overtly subsidized. They just aren't. We're not paying extra money for them. On top of that, no, we're not. So and we don't even know how to price the social cost of carbon adequately. So whatever metric they come up, they go for the highest number. They multiply it with CO2 emissions. It's not a fair argument. And then I look at the money the US government gives for nuclear power, and it's like 1 or 2% of all subsidy money, right? So maybe speak a little bit to that. Like, what is the actual subsidies thrown around?
Yeah, well, so the Texas Public Policy Foundation, they did a study, I think it was last year, or maybe it was 2020, regardless, where essentially they found that up till 2019, and with Build Back Better, it has not gotten better in this regard, with Build Back Better. Anyway, that solar and wind receive 50 times the subsidies per unit of energy produced than basically their next highest, which I think was coal, but it may have been oil, I forget. Regardless, we're not talking, oh my goodness, solar and wind, they're just eking it out, trying to go along in this free market. Well, those big oil, of course, everyone gets lobbying. That's public choice economics. Unfortunately, that's how it works. Unfortunately, but like, these are not the same. I want to say they were talking like tens of billions of dollars for solar and wind, and
70.
Yeah, couple billions of dollars for natural gas, for coal, which obviously, in general, as a free market, think tank, we're kind of like, well, that's wasted money anyway. It's just a negative sum game. But, it's still something that there's not comparable, or they are comparable. And the comparison is really high for renewables. Yeah. Well, renewables, because, cobalt is not renewable, but you know what I mean? Yeah.
So I wanted you to speak also to another thing. You sort of touched on it earlier, but the risk of nuclear proliferation. So it's obviously a big debate. My personal view just is, we know that International Atomic Energy Agency inspections actually work. Since we started with them, there's been no proliferation. But some countries have what you would call a nuclear readiness sort of foreign policy. So they like Japan, Taiwan, Argentina, South Africa. I suppose we have the expertise to quickly develop a nuclear bomb if we want to. We haven't yet, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe just speak to that risk, that sort of elephant in the room, that nukes are going to make bombs, basically.
Well, like I said, they haven't. No fissile material has been turned into nuclear weapons. If you're a country that wants to get nuclear weapons, you buy it off the black market from someone like North Korea or whatever. If one assumes the realist perception of international relations, then of course, it's an anarchic state. There's no really overarching world government. There isn't. Come on. And so as a result, well, nations are going to do what is in their best interest, and that is attempt to get on that playing field of nuclear weapons. So yeah, many states have said, no, don't worry, we're not going to do that. And many have said, no, we very much intend to do that. And no one has successfully done that using nuclear power. First off, you'd have to refine it. There are building a nuclear refinement facility to turn fissile material into the kind of enrichment that you would need to make it into a nuclear weapon would be very different. No, obviously you could build a dirty bomb or whatever, but come on, you're not going to be, it is not the same as ICBMs to dirty bombs. You could commit terrorism with dirty bombs. You're not going to declare your place on the world stage. With that, you need ICBMs for that, or not intercontinental, but still nuclear weapons of some kind. And so, yeah, just talking to that, like, that's not the avenue anyone has taken, and that's not the avenue anyone's likely to take, given, and I talk about this in one of my other nuclear articles, which I think it's the misunderstood part 2 or whatever. But yeah, the enrichment of fissile material into something that you could turn into weapons is not something that is easy to, that kind of facility, that kind of expertise is not something you can just whip out with your, nice nuclear power fissile material.
Yeah, the general expectation is that if you wanted to do that, it's like Josh said, it would be easier to go purchase enriched uranium from another nuclear actor like China, North Korea, something like that. So in world history, what people are saying they're worried about has never happened. Where the only places where Iran is the obvious example, where they keep getting closer, they stair step closer to building the enrichments, basically the centrifuges that they need. And every time there is a world response, and it typically involves some sort of sanctions against Iran or whatever country is trying to do this, or in some extreme cases they may have even done limited strikes to damage that facility. So it's not the kind of thing where you're just like, oh, I'm going to go make a nuclear bomb. I'm going to do it in my backyard or in my garage. You need certain technologies, and as soon as you start putting those technologies together, the satellites flying overhead catch it pretty much immediately, and then the entire world stage is warned, like, oh, that's this guy over here is doing this, or this country is doing this. We need to do something to address that.
Right, and I mean, just on the Iranian issue, which is the elephant in the room, it's a very good book written by Gareth Porter, which called it the manufactured crisis, where he made the argument that a lot of that nuclear scare of Iran took place in the aftermath of the Iraq War, and we know the Bush administration had plans drawn up to invade Iran, so it was sort of like a weapons of mass destruction thing. And when you look at the actual evidence, even the International Atomic Energy Agency concluded that Iran had a nuclear capability policy, not a nuclear weapons policy. And if you were to enrich uranium, you'd need a football field. I mean, it's, you say, you will see it you will pick it up. Intelligence agencies will know about it. Right. So, so it sort of just speaks to that point that scare is really, that's sort of one of the elephants I wanted to get to. The other one about nuclear is the financing for this. Now, my understanding of the United States, and do correct me if I'm wrong, is that the U.S. public is opening up to using nuclear weapons. It's about the nuclear weapons, nuclear reactors. Sorry.
Yes.
Not weapons. And there is bipartisan support for that, right? It seems to be the only thing that you guys still agree on. So, how would the government, because government will be involved when nuclear is there, how would the government get involved, and how would you finance it, and how would you structure the projects to not repeat the mistakes that they made with the other reactors that took so long to build?
Well, so I think I'm obviously speaking monolithically about a very diverse group of people who have different ideas and different perceptions and stuff. To say that, oh, obviously both parties agree that nuclear is the way to go. It's like, maybe rhetorically, in terms of action, I'm less convinced. I feel, obviously it depends on the individual, but it feels that some people are like, oh yeah, we get to claim all the, brownie points of, oh yeah, you did the good job. You threw money at it in the Build Back Better bill or whatever. Good job. When in reality, they know nothing is going to get passed because the NRC is going to stonewall every single attempt. Other people, I'm sure, are like, yay, it's great. We can't wait to find this, carbon, low carbon emitting. Obviously, it doesn't emit carbon, but in the production of nuclear plants, blah, 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 you know what I mean? It's so great. It's so awesome. We're very for nuclear. It depends on the individual. But to say that, oh yeah, everybody is pro-nuclear and wants there to be change versus wants to say they like nuclear and wants to say they want there to be change, I think those are two different things. But yeah.
So do you think the regulator is still like too strong in the US in blocking these things?
Yeah.
Yeah, the NRC has a very big footprint when it comes to what's going to happen and when it will happen, what would be allowed to happen. And then there is a diversity of views on this because there are many groups like the Sierra Clubs of the world. They still are very openly and adamantly opposed. They want, and from their website, they say they want a nuclear-free future. So they make no bones about it, and they are very active. Them and NRDC and other groups like that are very active in Washington, D.C., lobbying to get nuclear stopped and shut down. So in general, I believe that, yes, you're correct. Nuclear is not the four-letter word that it had been for the past like 30 plus years, where people were afraid of it and really didn't want anything to do with new nuclear. They kind of grudgingly accept if there's a nuclear plant in their town or in their state, they would go, okay, we've already built it. It seems to be operating safely. We'll just sort of leave that alone. But when it came to building new, they were less excited. That is starting to shift, and it's largely due, I think, to not only nuclear safety record, which is pretty much unblemished, and its reliability, and the fact that it's the most energy dense form of electricity generation that we have. So overall, it produces some of the lowest impact environmentally per kilowatt hour produced. But they also are dealing with the fact that, while it's not my primary concern, climate change for some people is a primary motivating factor. And so if you're going to try to cut CO2 emissions from electricity generation, you need to, if you're closing down fossil fuels, well, you need something else that provides reliable, affordable electricity. When, going back to what we discussed before, wind and solar with their lower capacity factors and intermittency issues, you need something that's there that you can trust, so that when you flick that light switch, the lights will come on. Or when you turn the thermostat dial, your heater comes on, or your heat pump or something like that actually works. That's what nuclear does. And at the same time, it has no airborne emissions. It's completely emissions free in terms of coming from the reactor. So yeah, it's safety, it's longevity, all of those issues are working in favor of nuclear. And as more information gets out and the public gets better educated about it, then they're starting to see, okay, actually nuclear is very safe, it's very reliable, it's very long-lived, it's very energy dense. So they're moving more and more in that direction.
But I mean, even still in the United States, like Indian Point in New York was shut down a couple, what was last year, right? I mean, it's off, and Palisades in Michigan, I mean, the governor had a token effort of, wait, no, maybe don't, please, but it was too late by a significant margin.
And what was it replaced with? Like, was they actually renewables replacing the generation, or did they just turn up coal or gas or something?
Right now, it has not been replaced. So for the Palisades plant specific to Michigan, it was one 811 megawatt plant that was closed. And right now it's in the early stages of decommissioning. So it still is possible that, like, there's a program, the Civil Nuclear Credit Program, that was put out by the Biden administration, which is basically federal funding that would help retain these struggling nuclear plants. The reason they're struggling, again, is going back to what I said before, heavily subsidized renewables can undercut LCOE. They can undercut the price that a nuclear plant can afford to pay. So subsidies are screwing up and causing problems for pricing mechanisms in our electricity markets, which means these plants are having difficulty competing. Okay, so that's where the Civil Nuclear Credit Program, this $6 billion federal funding program, comes in. And if the plant is approved for funding under this civil CNC program, then it would be able to be refueled and turned back on. So decommissioning is like a multi-decade process, 20 plus years, and they're only in like the first few months of doing it. So all they've done basically is pull the spent fuel out of the reactor and put it into a cooling pond, and now they're just waiting. So it's still possible to refuel the reactor and turn it back on.
Well, the Chinese actually has, in my view, the best attitude to decommissioning, where they take the view that anything that is radioactive, high dose, gets treated fine, and everything else you put a sign up saying beware of the dog. That's it, right? Yeah. And that's sort of the way people need to go, as opposed to trying to demolish it and take the paint down that they've been going in Germany. And it's enormously expensive stuff, and that's the argument again that the environmentalists have used against nuclear. They're saying, but look at how expensive decommissioning is. And my argument to that is yes, because the regulations are making it expensive.
Right. So now we're going to endure the same thing with the expense of landfilling solar panels and wind turbine blades. So we're doing the exact same thing. Again, are we being honest about the discussion that we're having? That's like those costs apply equally and probably even more so because you also have to do mine reclamation and the transmission lines and all that sort of stuff. So solar and wind have a heavier weight to lift in that regard than does nuclear.
Well, so I think an important thing here when it comes to the investment side of this, it's like, so why aren't we seeing like people jumping to nuclear? It's like, so I think an important thing to discuss, it's obviously in the news a bit, is the environmental social governance criteria, ESG, and basically nuclear is basically blacklisted. I mean, it's not explicitly, sometimes explicitly, but oftentimes more implicitly not included in, good environmental stuff. Like, no, we don't do nuclear. Solar, wind, of course. Yeah, hydro occasionally, but solar and wind are it, and definitely not nuclear. And obviously not fossil fuels.
Well, the argument that the head of the Institute of Civil Engineers group made a few years ago, it doesn't change the guy's name, was that nuclear, it's a long-term process. So you get a lower return maybe, and it can encourage pension funds to invest it, put their money into it. And that would obviously, the public would feel much more comfortable, taking care of the plant, whereas wind and solar and all these things have short-term periods. They attract all these crony capitalists. So he was sort of using that argument and saying, well, yeah, it is a long-term 1-2% return on investment maybe, but if you've got a big pension fund with a massive, for match and lump sum, you'd like an investment like that. So it's also a different type of investor that will attract. And I sort of that also goes missing in this whole conversation,
Well, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. The long-term investments like that. I mean, it's the old saying for investment, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Right.
Okay, well, you always, I mean, depending on your age, how close you are to your retirement, you might be more risky. You might want to take a bigger chunk of higher risk options, but you always want that steady, constant performance, which, I mean, works for investments. It works for electricity grids. It works. You always want that kind of steady, long-term performance that is always going to be there. The other stuff out on the sides, which, like, oh, we're up today, now we're down tomorrow, and we're up.
Well, here's another interesting fact about investment that about nuclear waste. Nuclear waste has a half-life. So the longer you wait, the less you have to treat, right? So from an investment point of view, it's a negative interest rate. Which, I haven't seen also people talk and investigate this question where what does it mean to buy nuclear waste treatment? Because you technically don't have to do anything and you get paid to do it because it costs less as you kick the can down the road.
Right.
It's one of the few problems in the world where it makes sense to kick the can down the road.
Yeah, and those cans we've written articles about this that, like, they've even flown rockets into the dry storage casts at 600 miles per hour, and they basically went in a half an inch to an inch, and they were fine. No radioactive material was released. They've simulated flying 737s into them. Those are some of the safest containers that you can imagine. So, and also, I mean, if you look at pictures, if anybody has not been to one of these storage sites, these areas where the nuclear waste is stored, you could eat off the floor. They're spotless. Yeah. They are absolutely clean, and they're some of the safest places you can imagine because they're protected because of the concerns.
And they tend to be isolated as well. I mean, South Africa's one area called Valpits in the middle of the Karoo Desert, which literally it's got like, I think, one person per 100 square mile for that argument. There's literally nobody living there. And it's basically a hole in the ground where the stuff goes, and that's it, And that thing has been built for a few nuclear power plants, so we can just build new ones. We don't even have to care. So it's like the waste issue is one that frustrates me because it's just not an issue.
Well, on top of that, I mean, 90% of it calling it nuclear waste is not exactly like, well, it's spent fuel. You can recycle it over and 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 over again. And so, by the end of it, it's like, okay, we don't do that. So of course there's even more, but you can get a lot more out of this. And on top of getting a lot more out of it, I mean, governmental gridlock prevented the Yucca Mountain facility from being built. It's just put it there. But like, I think I think it was Mark Nelson, I forget who, was saying that you could store all the nuclear waste the United States has ever produced on a football field less than 10 yards deep. Like, that's not counting there was many times you can recycle and all that stuff. It's like, this is not, oh my gosh, what do we do with the waste? It lasts forever, and it's this crazy thing. It's like, yeah, the Mojave Desert has nothing going on. You just slap it in the mountain, just like you're saying. There's no one there. I mean, obviously there are cities, but you know what I mean? Like, you put it in Yucca Mountain and just let it sit there, after recycling it plenty of times. I mean, this is really, at least you get to choose what to do with nuclear waste. You don't get to choose what to do with, emissions that come from all various sorts of things. You don't get to choose what you do with other forms of energy.
And I mean, the waste we generally landfill. There's very few things that are really recyclable in this world. I think only tin cans and aluminum is profitable. Most things, it still makes sense to landfill. It's also the argument the environmentalists don't like, but it's just a fact of life.
Yeah,
correct.
Gentlemen, just as a last point, anything message you want to get out there? Any interesting stuff you're working on, and before we close down?
Yeah, I mean, I just like an important thing. I assume we have a generally, audience that is not climate catastrophists exactly, but we have good news, as the not alarmist. Hey, everything's going to end in a decade. I mean, my peers. I am 21 years old, so
there's 7 years left to live. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I know, it's tragic. What am I going to do? It really changes my time preference. No, I mean, it really is. It's disconcerting the degree to which my peers are very, very concerned about what they perceive an existential threat, because, well, all the trusted people around them are saying that it is. It's like, we have good news. And that good news is, hey, everyone, we're not going to die. Like, just do simple cost benefit analysis. It's like, okay, yes, of course, assuming anthropogenic climate change for the sake of argument, then yes, it is going to have costs. But of course, it's going to have benefits as well. There's greening, there's a warmer world, and more people die freezing to death than they do of heat. So maybe that's a good thing. I mean, technological advancement and general societal advancement have decreased deaths from climate by 97% in the past century. Like, yeah, I mean, you read, Bjorn Lomborg, you read Alex Epstein, you read, Michael Schellenberg, all these people. It's like, Steve Koonin, it's like, it doesn't seem like, it seems the reasonable thing to say is, yes, there will be costs, as with everything that exists ever. Simply do cost benefit analysis.
And the solution is just to adapt, right?
Yes, adaptation. Right. Exactly. It's like, that currently 100 million people live below sea level. Like, they have dikes and dams and levees and all the various things necessary that a technologically powered, filled with energy kind of society can create, And so that's the way to fix things. I mean, Bjorn Lomborg talks about this a lot. He's like, hey there, random person starving in, whatever, India. The way to help this person is not say, don't worry, carbon emissions. It's, hey, here's a natural gas facility or a coal generator. That's how you help people in the time they'll be alive. It's not, oh, well, we signed an accord. Like, what do you mean? Like, no, if we want to help the most people, this is the way to do it. And I don't have this deep-seated hatred for, I assume I'm speaking for you as well. Like, it's not like, oh, I hate renewables, they're so horrible. Like, no, whatever works. It's simply that they don't. It's simply that this is not feasible. Sustainability is not sustainable for the population of Earth. And so it's like, yeah, and I mean, if one subscribes to the Julian Simon, Marian Tupy, all them, way of thinking that, yeah, I mean, things are going to get better and have gotten better as population has increased. So there's no reason to think, oh my goodness, there's a limiting point where it's all going to be horrible from down here. It's like, it sure seems like that's not the case. They just came out with a book, Superabundance, Tupy and Pooley. So I just got it for my birthday, actually. So I intend on reading it. But, we have a tale of optimism, and a truthful one too. Not just, head in the sand, like, no, everything's fine. Like, no, things are good. But I mean, you have this nihilism among so many people. I mean, antinatalism and all this stuff, and it's not necessary. It really isn't.
Yeah. The short version of that, there's a good story to tell, and people can be optimistic about the future. They don't need to fear that in 10 years, the human race is going to disappear from the planet. We're going to be doing better, and even out to 2100, talking about like the work of the IPCC and all that. We keep hearing that by the year 2100, some number of degrees Celsius, we're going to have increased our temperature. Even if that happens, even if the worst case, the most unrealistic, the RCP 8.5 or SSP 8.5 which nobody actually believes is realistic anymore. None of the scientists actually believe it. Even if that happens, we're still only just going to lose like a few percentage points off of GDP growth. There is so much good news out there that people can actually be positive and be excited about the future instead of being terrified.
Yeah, that's a very good message as well. And also my message as to people is to think for yourself. There's a lot of people who make money out of predicting the end of the world, and they tend to all be wrong with remarkable accuracy. Yeah. So, but thank you, gentlemen. It's a very nice conversation, and please keep publishing stuff. And guys, please go and read what the Mackinac Center has to say.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Hugo. Appreciate the time.
Yeah.